Good morning, church. How are we feeling today? Amazing. That's the first time I've heard that. It is a good Sunday. Welcome and happy Christmas Eve. It is such a joy to be with each and every one of you. I love all of you, and especially our guests who are with us this morning. Lots of new and smiling faces. I'm glad to see that our guests are in a good mood. We love having you. It is an honor if you are with us in person or online. It is really a beautiful time. But before we get into this morning, I just think there's been a lot of effort that's gone into making today great already. Can we give it up for Daryl and for Mallory and for Cynthia and everyone who helped our kids? Kids, that's for y'all. Y'all did a great job in setting the tone for worship today. Thank you so much for participating. You got a lot to be proud of. Also, give it up for our resident baristas this morning, Pam and Debbie and Maggie, who put on an incredible hot cocoa bar out there. Everyone should be just about to come off the sugar high. And it's going to be my job to try and keep us propped up. So wish me luck. Wish me luck. It is a beautiful time, and a time when most of us and the world at large has turned their attention to what we've been talking about and observing this morning, this miracle that people talk about, the incarnation of God in the flesh, but not just a birth, as many people observe during this time, but a coming. And it's an incredible thing, really. And I've good news for those of you who may be visiting with us today. As incredible as it is, and as much as I hope you've enjoyed it, we get to do this every day here. We do this every week, or at least we should. We ought to find ourselves regularly, consistently, perpetually in awe at the absurd suggestion that God has become man, and as John wrote, has tabernacled among us, made his place with us. But as is human nature, anything that we experience with consistency has a tendency to shamefully become common to us. Think about the things that you used to pray for and wait for and call for, and now just seem so regular to you that when you do realize you haven't thought about it in a while, you feel really bad. This, I think, happens so much with the idea that God would be found amongst these little lambs up here in a manger, in the flesh, in the dirt, in the dust, and among us. So it seems more than good to us today to rekindle that awe of the reality that the God of all that ever is, ever will be, ever has been, came down, tore the veil apart, stepped into time, drew breath, cried, hurt, loved, walked among us. Make no mistake, no matter where I go this morning, and those of you who are regulars here know sometimes we go a little crazy and we get into a rabbit hole. No matter where we end up today, the center of everything that we hope for is that the Creator God became human. And so with that, we're looking at the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're looking at the beginning of the gospel accounts, the beginning of the New Testament. But I'm going to spare you, and you'll see for just a second why I've done you a tremendous favor. See, the setting of the scene for the birth of Jesus and the coming of God in the flesh, Matthew has the unique task of figuring out how to begin this story. Where do we start? And to us, especially as really attention deficit Western Americans, he chooses probably the most boring way that you could ever imagine. Because verses 1 through 17 of the book of Matthew are a genealogy of the history of the line of Jesus. And I know that all of you who woke up this morning were thinking, you know what I hope Marcus has for us? Some genealogical heat. I hope that's what we get to talk about on Christmas. You know what, Marcus? I don't care about a Christmas tree today. I want to lean into a family tree today. I don't think anybody had that idea when they woke up this morning. I think it's a really quick way to age yourself if you would be excited about the genealogy, verses 1 through 17. There's a lot of value there, and I think that's something that we need to take apart and look at a future date. But frankly, we know men reach a point in their lives where they have to choose between either smoking meats or doing World War II history. But the next level of your aging is, becoming an unofficial ambassador for 23andMe and going way back in your family tree and figuring out what your family crest was and tracing yourself back to Louis XIV or something really cool like that. I get it though, because there are cool stories, important stories buried in the genealogy. We actually can learn a lot about what this God is like by what his genealogy is. There are cool stories in my family tree. We are related, not very closely, and certainly not close enough to cash a check, to the Folgers coffee fortune. And I didn't find that out till about 5 years ago. And now I have my own jingle. It goes something like this. The best part of waking up is not being related enough. Doesn't do any good, but it's a cool story. It's a cool story. There are two brothers in my family tree that fought on opposing sides in the Civil War. That's a really cool story. There's the STI-STE situation that some of you know a little bit about, and some of you don't worry about it. That's not for today. And the one that I'm really mad about is that I found out a few years ago that we have an actual ancestor that came to this country on the Mayflower, like the literal Mayflower, like the first boat to ever show up here. And I didn't find this out until I was like 35. The reason why I'm mad is I procrastinated on a lot of social studies fair projects, and I feel like that's a guaranteed win. Nobody told me. But all jokes aside, and to Matthew and to the Jews who are the audience for this gospel, verses 1 through 17 are immensely vital. They're vital because they introduce Jesus as the rightful heir to the throne of David. And for any nation of antiquity, the royal bloodline was important, but especially the Jews. And especially the Jews because they had the promises of God, and they had been waiting for a long time to see the Messiah. And this is Matthew's prologue. It's not just an old man's hobby. It firmly establishes and decisively establishes Jesus. And it quickly removes all shadow of a doubt that this is indeed the one for whom they have been waiting and praying for so long. This is truly the return of the King. But things get crazy in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 18, our text for today. I'm going to read it one more time. It says, "Now the birth of Jesus took place in this way when his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph. Before they came together, she was found with a child from the Holy Spirit, and her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly." There's a certain level of scandal in the genealogy of Jesus. There are names like Tamar and names like Rahab and people like David who were great in their own right but had really dark chapters in their life when they fell to the lowest of lows. But the scandal continues at the very birth of Jesus because now this man Joseph, of whom we know very little, is in a situation that none of us would want to be in. He is betrothed. He is engaged. And I need to stress this morning that betrothal for the Jews is not the same as betrothal is for Americans in 2023. Betrothal to the Jews is a done deal. The papers were signed. The rest was basically a formality. Jesus' generation is so far away from the generation of 90 Day Fiancé, it's not even funny. The punishment for one to be found with an illegitimate child would have been nothing less than extreme public humiliation. I want you to think about a period of time in our country like the 50s or 60s or 70s. And then I want you to amplify it by about 10 times because by the law, it could have even resulted in death. So what's happening in this narrative is that there's no question about whether this Mary, chosen of God, was going to experience shame in the community. It's not a question about whether this was going to be a shameful situation. The question is how much shame is going to be put on her. And so we see Joseph now, her husband, being a just man, unwilling to put her to that shame, reasons and resolves to put her away quietly. And there's this tension that's emerging in the text, this tension that reveals the character and the heart of this Joseph, a man whose only desire is to do the right thing, but he's caught between the tension of justice and mercy. And I would suggest that out of everything that Matthew's writing here, this is the thread that he wants us to take deep into our hearts, this tension between justice and mercy. And you might be thinking, I'm not really sure how that's something that makes any sense to me today. But I want you to stop and think for a second. Society can only exist in the tension between justice and mercy. Justice must be done or society falls apart. And yet every single one of us knows that we need mercy. And when we are caught up in an altercation, we hope that mercy is granted to us. But you have to have justice. If you don't have justice, it's anarchy. If somebody commits a violent crime and then they go before the judge, and the judge just says, well, you said you're sorry. We're going to release you back out into the public. We're going to grant you mercy. How does that impact the community in which the crime was committed? You can't just have blind mercy. There's always a price for mercy. There's always a cost. Somebody has to pay it, because if you release a violent criminal or a murderer back into the community, you might grant him mercy and say, we forgive you, but now everyone else in the community pays the price. The family who is the victim of that crime pays the price. The community that now doesn't feel safe pays the price. It's got to get paid somewhere. And so Joseph is in a situation where he knows there has to be justice. But I want so badly to exercise mercy. The tension between justice and mercy. So Joseph, not wanting to make her a spectacle, decides and reasons to put her away secretly. Of note for us is just to realize that in the hands of another who wasn't like Joseph, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Mary, the one who is venerated now, would have ended up like the woman at the well in John chapter 4, by herself. Multiple men that she's tried to fill the hole with. But the way that Joseph operates and navigates this situation allows the narrative of God to go the direction in which it's intended. So consider the integrity of this man, of whom so little is written, yet God knew he would excel in this most trying circumstance. Much is written of Mary, and much is made of Mary, and that's rightfully so. But I don't think we make enough of Joseph. And I don't think I take seriously enough when something unfair happens to me that requires justice, and I'm caught in that tension, that God may have known I can let Marcus experience this situation because he's a man of integrity, and he will choose to do the right thing. He will not choose to retaliate for the sake of retaliation. When you're in the heat of the moment, have you ever stopped to consider God's watching you? And God believes in you in that moment. And so here's what happens. It says that Joseph is reasoning. He's trying to figure out what is happening. In verse 20, it says he considered these things. He is thinking about what to do. He ponders these things. He is testing that balance between justice and mercy. And the question that is in his mind is, what do I do with Mary? What do I do with her? Because justice has to be done. Here's the reality. Joseph's in the unenviable position of either putting Mary, the woman that he loves and was committed to, away and to an open shame for what appears to be obvious infidelity. Or he must keep her. And if he keeps her, then he suffers the open shame of having a bride that was not faithful to him and a bride that's found with an illegitimate child. He has to deal with people thinking whatever they want to think, who don't know the story, who are going to say whatever they want to say, who are going to always talk reckless and be out of pocket and say inappropriate things to his wife and to his kid. He has to take that on. He's got to deal with the sneers and slander. He's got to deal with people speaking reckless for as long as they're alive. And so Joseph is torn between putting Mary away and putting the shame on her, or keeping Mary and putting the shame on him. This should be a familiar tension to us. If you know how God deals with us, your alarm bell should be going off right now. See, what's happening with Joseph is not just a man in a bad situation, not just a man making the most of a bad situation. What's happening with Joseph is something that tells the story of what is constantly happening between God and man. And it's revealed in the incarnation, the narrative itself. Any parent knows what it's like to wrestle with the tension between justice and mercy, because you know the kid messed up and you don't want to punish them, because if they cry and those crocodile tears and those puppy eyes happen, you're going to feel like a terrible person. But if you don't punish them, things are going to be way worse in the end. The tension between justice that has to be done not to spoil the child and mercy because you love the child and you don't want to see the child hurt. Every parent knows that. Every spouse knows the tension between justice and mercy. Every one of you knows the tension between justice and mercy when Marcus crosses the 30-minute mark on a Sunday morning. How many pleas have you written to the NFL to make sure the Vikings play in the 4 o'clock slot and not the noon? In verse 20, something interesting happens. It says, as he's considering these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appears to him and says, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to make or to take Mary as your wife. Now, this is interesting because this angelic apparition is kind of a familiar situation for those of us who have read about these happening in Scripture before, but things are totally out of whack this time. Okay? The first thing that the angel says to him is, Joseph, son of David, you are in an unenviable position, Joseph, but remember who you belong to. Remember whose you are. You will not do this well if you forget who you belong to. Joseph, son of David, remember who you are. Then he goes on to say, don't be afraid. But not the way we usually hear don't be afraid. When angels appear in the Old Testament and the New Testament, usually they say, do not fear, do not be afraid, because sometimes they look crazy, sometimes they are shining in light, sometimes they show up in a bedroom in the middle of the night. It's appropriate to say, do not be afraid of me. They're always saying, don't be afraid, so I can give you the message that God has sent me to give you. But this angel doesn't say to Joseph, don't be afraid of me. He says to Joseph, don't be afraid to be. He doesn't say, don't be afraid because I'm scary looking and I'm in your room and you were sleeping and you're in a bad situation. He says, don't be afraid to choose mercy. And this is the fear. If I show mercy in this situation, what about justice? If I show mercy to my neighbor, what about justice? The angel goes on, he says, this child is the one. She will bear a son. You will call his name Jesus, for he will save their people from their sins. This is not a normal child. This is not a normal situation. He is the one you have been calling for. He is the Messiah. He is him. Mary is faithful, and this is part of a prophecy. He shall be called Jesus. It doesn't really translate well to our English because there's a really common name back then. It's a lot closer to Joshua, so it's kind of like, I don't even know what the common names are anymore. That's what makes me feel old more than anything, because there was always an Ashley and a Brittany when I grew up, but they're not naming people Ashley and Brittany really that much anymore. There was always a Mark or Brandon or a Corey or something like that. This is the type of name that Jesus has. It doesn't sound overly impressive. It's a common name, but it's a common name with power. This is a kid that is going somewhere. He is going to save his people from their sins. In other words, Joseph, and in other words to every single one of us made in God's image, God is never going to ask you to do something that he is not willing to do or has not already done for you. So God says to Joseph, don't be afraid to choose mercy, because the entire point of this child is mercy. Don't be afraid to choose mercy, because what I'm doing right now by coming into this world is choosing mercy on a cosmic scale for you and for everybody else. You don't have to be afraid to choose mercy, because I am choosing mercy for you. Verses 22 through 25 go like this. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord has spoken by the prophet. He channels Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. They shall call his name Emmanuel." It actually says in that text, "The Lord himself shall give you a sign," and this is the sign. This is how you know. And that name Emmanuel means God with us. God with us. What does that mean to you? God with us. What did it mean for the children of Israel? What does it mean to Joseph as he's receiving this? In Zephaniah chapter 3, it reads something like this. It says, "For at that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord, and I will save them with one accord." It says, "On that day," in verse 11 of Zephaniah 3, "you shall not be put to shame because of the deeds by which you have rebelled against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proudly exultant ones." He continues and says, "Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughters of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. He is not looking down on you in judgment. He is not far from you. He is not in a distant land. He is not asleep. He didn't just wind up this clock and let it go. He is in your midst." Now, for Israel, they traditionally went after other gods, and God is constantly chastising them for it. There are wars, there are captivities, but even though God is a God of justice, the prophecy that is connected to the arrival of Jesus is that God is taking away their judgments and he's taking away their sins. He continues to go, and this just shows God's heart. "I will save the lame. I will gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time, I will bring you in. At that time, when I gather you together, for I will make you renowned and praised among the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord." What would you do different in your life if you truly knew that God wasn't just looking down on you in derision and in judgment? What would you do if you knew that God was in your midst? How would you behave? How would you deal with adversity? How would you wrestle with the tension between justice and mercy? What kind of a parent would you be if you knew God was in your midst? What kind of a spouse would you be? What kind of a brother or a sister or a student or a boss would you be? Who would you be if you knew what Joseph now knows? Joseph awakens in verse 24, and it says that he has a renewed resolve. When Joseph awakes from his sleep, he does as the angel of the Lord commands him, and he takes his wife. He knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. We see Joseph now not afraid to choose mercy because he knows what God is doing and will do, and he knows he can make that choice. This is so important for us, family, because if God is not with us, you do have to be afraid. If God is not in our midst, if no Emmanuel, if no God with us, then there is no justice to be done. If God is not with us, you do have to execute justice as you see it, which is often flawed and biased at the expense of everyone and everything that's going to end up being collateral damage. If no Emmanuel, then all our lives are a constant dance of attempting to make each other pay for a debt that the scripture says we could never pay. Have you thought about that? If no God with us, if no Emmanuel, then your life is just a dance of trying to get people to pay a debt they could never pay. That's why the bitterness never ends. That's why the envy never ends. That's why the anger never ends. That's why your shame never ends. But in verse 25, his name was called Jesus, the incarnation of justice and mercy on the scales, tipped totally in our favor, only by grace and power and love forever. If you ever look at this text again, I want you to realize that what Matthew is doing is not just telling a story for legal records of how we get from the beginning to Jesus, from David to Jesus and what happened with Joseph. He's not just using the scandal to make a compelling story. He is writing with a purpose that is more than Jesus as rightful king. He is writing to illuminate the fulfillment of all these prophecies we've even looked at today. And not only that, he is writing to show the working out of justice and mercy on a cosmic scale. These two polar opposites somehow colliding, and in the process, our debts being wiped away. What does this look like in action? What's the end of these things? What is the outcome of this tension between justice and mercy? In the book of Revelation, verse 21, it reads like this, verses 2 through 5. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard with a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man." The dwelling place of God is with us. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." And he also said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." This is the new world that Jesus ushers in. Everywhere Emmanuel goes, things are healed. People are healed. Everything that Jesus touches is made whole. I think about my life and my mistakes. And every morning you wake up and in some sense you're brought into a confrontation with that tension between justice and mercy, because I don't think there's one of us that wakes up and looks in the mirror and thinks, "I'm so glad there's someone like me on this earth. Boy, I am perfect. Barbara brought the hairline up a little higher. They won't even know. I am good." No. I think about all the mistakes that I've made. I think about the lies that I've told. I think about the times that I manipulated situations. I think about all the times that I've fallen short. And this text forces me to remember that the real message of Christmas, the real thing that we celebrate, is God meeting you in that space and saying, "I know, but if you trust me and choose mercy, it's on me. I've got it." And the shame that you feel for the justice you know you deserve, I'm going to give you mercy instead. That's what I'm here to do. I'm willing to bet that there is somebody here today, or somebody listening, who believe that their lives are like Mary's life. It's not a question of whether you feel shame. It's just a question of how much shame I feel on this day. Sometimes I don't even feel like getting out of bed. Sometimes I don't feel like I can show my face. You know, deep down inside you deserve justice. I'm here to remind you. I'm here to announce to you, just like it was announced to Joseph, you don't need to be afraid. Because this Jesus, this God with us, this Emmanuel has broken into this world in that unending tension of justice and mercy. And the question of what do I do with Mary that gets applied to every single one of us? What do I do with Marcus? What do I do with Wayne? What do I do with each and every one of you? What do I do with them? God in that moment has chosen to bear the open shame himself. Even though justice must be satisfied, instead of judgment, you can have mercy. You can live. Your shame is removed. Your debt has been paid because God is with us. He who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." Write this down. These words are trustworthy and true. So for any who may be with us today, this is an incredible occasion for you to be made new too. If we can serve you, we'd love to pray with you. We'd love to meet you at the back or down in front as we stand and sing.